All right. This is one of the funnest videos that I've wanted to make for a very long time, but I've always kind of been scared of the math. And honestly, I'm going to pull up my notepad right now if Fortnite will stop fighting me for full screen, and you'll probably see why. I had a lot to say here. You could probably hit pause right here and skip the whole video, but I think my comments on it are going to make this worth watching. Obviously, Scourge and Nocturno will be perked as such throughout the video, and there are obviously reasons for these perks, so link to their videos down below. These are not the quote-unquote best perks, so to speak. These are preferred / highest DPS, meaning the Scourge. Like, okay, technically, maybe you give it a fire rate and it'll perform better on paper, but it'll overheat faster. In my old video, I recommended like heat capacity, I think, but they actually tweaked it at a certain point so it can shoot longer now, and I do believe a double crit build works completely fine. And then, of course, if you want to run totally rocking out, that's what the videos get into. Nocturno, same deal. Reload doesn't actually add any damage. You could do more with the damage perk, but because of that 6th perk and just the way that I like to run ARs, I explain, reload is kind of an option there. And then there are some other options that, videos down below if you really want to get into that. Today is not a best perks video. I just wanted to solidify these are the perks I'm using and that's what I'm running with. Also, a lot of this math is going to be sort of conceptual based on my stats and, trying to be rational. So it's not like an end-all be-all thing, but I wanted to compare the Nocturno versus the Storm King Scourge. Which one of these is better? Because both of these weapons are two of the strongest weapons in the entire game. I will honestly not say that either of these are the best AR in the game. I have a whole video on that linked down below. It's inconclusive for a reason, because even if both of these are pretty much up there for the highest DPS ARs, there are still edge cases like the Floor Flusher doing a ridiculous amount to the correct element. And then there are lots of different ARs that kind of perform in weird ways where damage per second, overall damage output isn't even really what you should be looking at. And it's just very, very tricky. You give the Hydra double crit damage and first shot Rio, and it's just not even the same conversation. So yeah, that video gets into all of that. So let's talk about the Nocturno versus Storm King Scourge, because as I was saying, both of these are two of the strongest ARs in the entire game, and they both have very similar 6 perks. The Scourge triggers an explosion every 5 hits on the same target, or it'll deal 100% of your damage when you switch targets as well. And that is ridiculous. You can literally, as this clip here can show, this is without a loadout, by the way. This is just a ninja loadout. None of my weapons damage is bonus in this clip. Every time you switch targets on a per bullet basis, one bullet, one bullet, one bullet, one bullet, you are essentially doing double damage. Meaning when you just wave through a crowd of enemies, you'll just annihilate everything. And I also want to show one thing, because I'm going to be showing a lot of gameplay throughout this. I only recorded the one clip with the ninja loadout. This is what I was using for this entire video. For the rest of the footage, I should say. Very typical Rescue Trooper Ramirez, give me 50%, blast in the past, blah, 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 blah. Really, really boring stuff. Just a very, very cliche build. And we're going to be talking about some other options later on anyway. So let's talk about the Storm King's Scourge. So I did a little bit of math that is worth getting into, and it's not going to be heavily shown here, but we do have a calculator. This was made by me and a friend of mine. I really should do a video on this. I'll link it down below so you can make your own stuff. Just go to view or file or whatever, make a copy. I don't know where it is, but yeah, make a copy, and it's not hard to do. I essentially just punched in the values here, and it outputs a number. These are things that we used to do by hand. This saves me a lot of time, and so just for the purposes of today's video, you can know that I did not pull these numbers out of my ass. All of these numbers were achieved without an active loadout. That's why I mentioned the ninja thing earlier. Actually, I should keep that up. And all of these were recorded without a loadout. Only gameplay was recorded with a loadout. I wanted to get the base numbers, and if you guys want to copy my stats, I am currently power level 136 with an offense of 3,522. I have put all of my supercharged heroes, or survivors, I should say, into my offensive stats, because that's how I like to roll. And so my weapons are going to do quite a bit more damage than most of you watching on a statistical basis. If you're also 136, then maybe not. But even if you're 137, you might do more than me. But that's where I'm at. Let's get into it. So the Scourge has a base DPS of 232,000. In fact, as I'm reading this, I think it's worth it to just do both at the same time. The Scourge has 232. The Nocturno has 230. So at a basic cursory overview, ignoring 6 perks, both of these weapons fall kind of in line with the Bobcat and the Silent Spectre. Both of these are just sort of base numbers from a long time ago using regular stats, but they're outdamaged by the Thrasher, and that's kind of an interesting thing to note, but I think we all know where this is going. The one thing I want to note with the Scourge is that it is locked to energy. And that's one of the things where these weapons are kind of similar at first, Scourge doing slightly more, but being locked to energy or physical, which you should never use unless you're in the end. Well, you should never use in the end game, which means if you're even a high enough level to be unlocking the Scourge normally, I don't care if you got carried, you guys don't count, you shouldn't have these weapons yet. If you're a 122 power level or higher, you should always be running the Scourge energy. You're essentially at a 25% debuff against all physical or all elemental enemies, I should say. So if I'm in my gameplay, I was recording in a nature zone. My Nocturno was fire, doing 100% of its damage to all the enemies, physical or nature, whereas the Scourge was doing 100% of its damage to regular physical enemies, but it was doing 75% of its normal damage against those elemental targets because of the way that energy works. So immediately, right out of the gate, the Scourge is at that debuff. But as you can see, its 6 perk doubles its damage all the way up to 464,000 or 384,000, which is still a ridiculous amount. The Nocturno has an explosion that's doing 65% of the damage dealt to it and enemies around it, buffing it all the way to 380,000. That's where I said that these numbers are all damage per second. These are averaged over time. That explosion isn't just pumping out 380,000 in a blink. That's not how that works. I'm just trying to keep it simple and over, damage over time terms. But so to speak, just for easy math, the Nocturno is doing more damage. But there are a couple of caveats. First and foremost, this is only when you're constantly switching between targets. And one of the cons I noted here was suppressive fire. And I feel a little silly even mentioning this, but it is something I have to address. If you go to any hero in the entire game, any soldier in the entire game, you will see that the class perk for soldiers, one of them being suppressive fire, gives you a 3% damage bonus, stacking up to 15%, so long as you stay on target. Now, 15% is not a serious debuff. It's not the biggest deal in the world. It's about what you get from supercharging a weapon. But it is something I want to bring up, and that is one of the things that factors into the conversation of Scourge versus Nocturno, is that the Nocturno, you're incentivized to stay on target, building up those stacks, and then exploding for 65% of the total damage dealt. The Scourge, and of course you're also getting the 15% as you go. For the Scourge, you're encouraged to actually switch off between targets to constantly be activating that explosion. Now, as you can see, getting up to 350,000, and then of course you're, affecting all the enemies around it. That's what this number is right here. We'll get into that in a second. It's okay. That 50% that you're losing out on works out in the end. It's definitely good to be switching targets, but it's something I wanted to bring up. Now, I'm not some kind of math nerd, okay? I don't know the exact way to write this. I think like caret and then the power 2 would be the right way to, whatever. What I'm saying here is the 5 hits cause an explosion, which means you're staying on target with the Scourge. Every 5 hits triggers that explosion. You'll be doing 46,000 DPS on average, plus or times the amount of enemies nearby, which means if you've got 10 enemies nearby, you'll be doing an extra 460,000 DPS. That's sort of what I'm saying there. If you're switching off between targets in a crowd of enemies, which I got plenty of gameplay for, enjoy, you are doing 100% bonus damage times the amount of enemies. So you're essentially doing an extra 230,000 damage, or 174 if they're elemental, times maybe 10 enemies. You'd be doing an extra million or 2.7 million damage to those enemies in general. And that's where the Scourge is, spoiler alert towards the end of the video, in my opinion, based on math and just sort of, practically speaking, the Scourge is definitely better than the Nocturno, but there are other considerations like the pros and cons list. So let's go there. The pros for the Scourge, hugely better 6 perk. You are getting a much higher damage bonus. I think 100% is better than 65% every time. Again, factoring the... I hate to keep bringing this up, but it is important, because when that 100% is doing, 75% towards the enemies, it's still a better bonus than 65%. Plus, it has a larger radius. I didn't mention this in any of my math, but the Scourge can affect in a 0.75 tile radius, whereas the Nocturno is a 0.5. Doesn't sound like much, but you are hitting more enemies in a wider range. It does matter. That does matter. It's hard to math them. It's hard to factor that into the math, but it is a thing. It also never has to reload. So every weapon in the game, every weapon with a magazine, I should say, does reload. And the Scourge can technically reload if you ever allow it to overheat, meaning you have to stop shooting for a while. You are technically, as the game reads it, activating a reload. But what that means is there are heroes like Crackshot that exist, which ups your damage for a crap ton, essentially 150% once you get all the way going, as long as you don't swap your weapons or reload, which means with the Scourge, if you're smart, using Crackshot in the lead and even Bulletstorm Jonesy in support, you'll just always have a stupidly high damage bonus activated. Now, you can't build, you can't switch weapons, you can't let it overheat, but so long as you keep it going, the Scourge can have a ridiculous damage multiplier. And running Crackshot in the lead with my Scourge is exactly why I supercharged it. It actually kind of happened as a coincidence that I have these both 144 for today's video, so we can have a pretty apples to apples comparison. But supercharging my Scourge was because I paired it with Crackshot and was like, this is awesome. I love that. However, with the Nocturno, you are constantly reloading for A, just because you need more bullets in your magazine, and B, because that's part of the way that the 6 perk activates. And that's one of the big caveats. So, in terms of big numbers, you can see that 380 is higher than 348. It's like, what? The Nocturno has a higher bonus. It's better, right? Well, you need to be a wizard to get exactly a 65% damage bonus all the time. Because in order to get that damage bonus, to activate that explosion, you need to reload or kill your target. And if your target's dead, you never actually did 65% more damage. You just shot at it with your normal 230,000 DPS, right? Whereas if you stop to reload, you are seizing fire, doing 0 more damage, and then triggering that explosion to get your DPS up to that 380,000, magical number. So you're never truly hitting these theoretical numbers. Now, with the Nocturno, as with plenty of my gameplay has probably shown, you're deleting crowds of enemies like that anyway. The actual damage per second is irrelevant when the crowd is already gone. And I was recording in a 160 zone because these are insanely powerful weapons. And that's where some of these numbers don't really matter. The Scourge, Nocturno, both of them are going to be just deleting crowds of enemies. On a personal basis, I think the thud of the Nocturno exploding is an incredibly satisfying sound. It's just a bassy boom that is just so satisfying to use. And I know that that's not a mathematical thing to point out, but I think we all know when it feels right, it just makes the experience so much better. In fact, you'll note I have the electroshock rifle supercharged. Not a fantastic weapon, but it feels so good to use that worked for me on a personal basis. I spent my superchargers on that and I've never regretted it. So that's what I wanted to get into with the cons here. So let's all right, let's keep going. Hugely better 6 perk. You never have to reload, so Crackshot is huge, and it's still accessible. If you're watching this video and you don't have a schematic for the Nocturno, all of this information is irrelevant because you can't get it. You can get dropped the weapon, okay. If you've got a friend who will hook you up, fantastic, good pal. But if you can't get the Nocturno, then you might as well just delete it because it doesn't matter. I want those back. But yeah, if you don't have the weapon, it doesn't matter. And then the cons, locked physical energy, went into that a lot. Energy ammo matters. I know some of you are rich and will scoff at this idea, but it's important to note that the Scourge is more expensive to operate. Energy is more expensive than light ammo. It is harder to farm. It's harder to get more of. It's worth noting. And at the exact same time, one of the pros I put into the Nocturno is that it uses light ammo, which is extremely cheap. So that might not matter to some of you, but I'm not going to not bring it up. And then the suppressive fire I already kind of mentioned. And yeah, so for the pros and cons of the Nocturno, I could only find one con, and that's that you can't get it anymore. The damage is insane. The 6 perk is awesome. It's cheap to use. It can be any element. It is, for all intents and purposes, a perfect AR. I mean, it's just like, there's a reason that the Nocturno was the $100 upgrade, mascot weapon of Save the World, because they just removed every single limiting factor. One thing I haven't addressed at all in this video is that the Scourge and the Nocturno were both designed to be somewhat idealistic weapons, perfect weapons, which means all of the perks are just amazing. Crit rating, double crit damage is typically on average the best damage you're going to get. You also have reload, mag size, even more damage if you want it. Scourge, same deal. Crit rating, double crit damage, because hey, we don't actually have to reload. There is no reload perk because you can't. And these weapons are just unlocked in that sense. And it's a very, very fantastic thing to say. So yeah, you can make up your own opinion. I think mathematically, it's not debatable that the Scourge is the stronger weapon. I think overall, it is the better weapon, but because of that, elemental bonus, I find it a lot more satisfying to use the Nocturno, and because it's not chewing through my energy ammo, my energy rations, it's also just cheaper and more convenient to use the Nocturno. So yeah, it's up to you guys, but there you go. Nocturno versus Scourge. Both are fantastic weapons, and I'm glad I can compare them because this was fun. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista at your checkout. I really do appreciate it. Videos like this are a little off the wall, take a little bit more effort to make, so any amount of support is very much appreciated. Twitch link down below. I actually recorded this during a stream. YouTube, subscribe if you're new. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day.
And then